For most of human history, war was savage, but it was inexpensive. Not inexpensive in moral terms. In logistical terms, armies were made up of men who already existed. Weapons were often tools they already owned. Campaigns were short, seasonal, and limited by food, distance, and weather. Kings didn't need accountants to wage war. They needed loyalty, horses, and patience. Then a single invention changed everything. Gunpowder didn't merely make war more lethal. It made war costly. And once war became costly, it stopped being a measure of bravery and became a test of financial endurance. Welcome to the financial timeline, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Before gunpowder, power was fragmented. Medieval Europe was a mosaic of lords, vassals, and obligations. Armies were temporary. Peasants were summoned, fought briefly, and returned home to harvest crops. Knights supplied their own armor. Castles were defensive tools, not instruments of expansion. War had built-in limits because it depended on people who still had to survive. No treasury could fund endless conflict because no treasury needed to push too hard, and armies melted away. Food ran short. Loyalty splintered. The system enforced restraint without written rules. Then gunpowder arrived in Europe, quietly, during the late Middle Ages. At first, it seemed unimpressive. Early cannons were unreliable. Primitive firearms were slow and inaccurate. The traditional elite dismissed them as loud novelties. They were doblere. But not for the reason most people assume. Gunpowder didn't matter because it killed knights. It mattered because it destroyed the idea of cheap war. Cannons transformed siege warfare almost overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries collapsed under sustained fire. Fortifications had to be redesigned. Thicker, lower, angled. That meant engineers, materials, time, money. Firearms reshaped armies. Training a knight took decades. Training a musketeer took months, but only if the state could afford weapons, powder, logistics, and constant resupply. Battles were no longer decided by what soldiers carried. They were decided by what governments could deliver. War stopped being local. It became industrial. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally. They were professionals who required year-round pay. Armies no longer dissolved after campaigns. They remained, drilled, and consumed resources, even in peacetime. Victory no longer belonged to the bravest. It belonged to whoever could keep paying. This marked the beginning of centralized power. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Small kingdoms couldn't maintain modern fortifications. Feudal obligations couldn't fund permanent warfare. Only centralized states with stable revenue could survive. Gunpowder didn't just defeat castles. It defeated decentralization. And once rulers realized war now required money, a new problem emerged. Where to get it? Temporary taxes weren't enough. Emergency levies couldn't sustain permanent armies, so states made a radical shift. They normalized taxation. What had once been occasional became permanent. What had once been negotiated became assumed. Subjects no longer owed just loyalty. They owed money. Even that wasn't sufficient. Gunpowder wars were vast, prolonged, and relentless. Cannons, powder, fortresses, ships, and soldiers cost more than taxes could raise. So governments turned to borrowing. This is where finance truly enters the story. States issued debt not as desperation, but as strategy. Wars were funded by bonds. Credit became a weapon. Bankers replaced nobles as the ruler's most valuable allies. A ruler who could borrow could fight longer than a ruler who was more loved but less financed. War stopped being limited by people. It became limited only by credit, and that changed everything. Once war could be financed, it could outlast public tolerance. Costs could be spread over decades. Losses could be postponed. Inflation could quietly absorb part of the burden. Entire populations could be mobilized financially without ever stepping onto a battlefield. This is the birth of the modern state: permanent taxation. Standing armies. Public debt. Centralized authority. None of this came from abstract theory. It emerged because gunpowder made the old way of fighting impossible. The human cost was enormous. Peasants paid higher taxes. Wages lagged behind prices. Inflation eroded savings. Debts outlived kings and were passed to generations who never voted for the war or lived through it. Yet the system survived because it worked. Gunpowder rewired the cost of war, and in doing so, it rewired the relationship between money and power forever. Once war became a permanent expense, states faced a dilemma they had never encountered at this scale. They couldn't fund it honestly. Raising taxes enough risked rebellion. Borrowing too much risked default. Reducing military spending meant falling behind rivals. So governments chose a quieter solution. They altered how the cost was felt. This is where inflation enters the story, not as accident, not as modern invention, but as structural response. Inflation had existed long before. Ancient rulers debased coins in emergencies, but those episodes were visible, dangerous, and short-lived. Push too far, and trust collapsed. Soldiers refused pay. Markets froze. Regimes fell. Gunpowder warfare changed the equation. Permanent war required costs to be spread quietly, gradually, and across people who might never see combat. Inflation did exactly that. Instead of extracting value openly through taxes, states extracted it indirectly by altering money's value. Instead of demanding more today, they demanded less tomorrow. The burden didn't vanish. It dissolved. Before gunpowder, inflation addressed events. After gunpowder, it managed systems. Gunpowder wars were not shocks. They were sustained drains. Cannons needed replacement. Powder spoiled. Weapons wore down. Fortresses required constant upkeep. Armies consumed resources every single day. Taxes couldn't keep up. Debt filled the gap. But debt brought another problem. Repayment. Inflation solved that too. As prices rose, the real value of debt fell. Governments learned, first slowly, then deliberately, that moderate inflation reduced war debts without formal default. Creditors were repaid nominally, but with diminished purchasing power. Political backlash was muted. The mechanism remained invisible. War became socially survivable. This is why inflation becomes persistent in gunpowder-era states. Not explosive, not hyperinflation, but steady erosion. Enough to relieve pressure, enough to buy time, enough to keep the system alive. Once this logic exists, it spreads. Military spending becomes permanent. Debt rolls forward. Inflation becomes tolerated, even expected. Financial systems evolve to manage these pressures, not eliminate them. Central authority strengthens, because coordination becomes necessary. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not just bigger wars, but financialized war. Violence no longer required immediate consent. It required liquidity. Political resistance could be outlasted. Costs could be deferred. Sacrifice could be generalized rather than targeted. Society changed. People who never fought still paid. Savings lost value quietly. Wages lagged behind prices. Entire generations inherited obligations created by wars they never chose. This is why modern states feel durable. Today, warfare isn't constrained by manpower. It's constrained by budgets. Aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, logistics networks. These are financial commitments as much as military ones. And just like in the age of gunpowder, the question isn't who fights best. It's who can afford to keep fighting. Restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from cost, when cost is absorbed, deferred, or disguised. Restraint weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is structural. It exists inside systems designed to make it sustainable. As long as those systems remain, money and violence will remain linked, even when the battlefield feels distant. This is why debt, inflation, and public finance can never be separated from power. They are not abstract concepts. They are tools that allow states to project force without collapsing. They are the legacy of the moment technology made violence too expensive to manage informally. Gunpowder didn't just change war. It changed what power required to exist. The lesson isn't that technology is evil or finance is corrupt. It's that systems evolve around the costs they must absorb. When those costs grow large enough, they reshape everything upstream: institutions, money, and lives. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with brutal consistency. When technology raises the price of power, money fills the gap. And once that bridge is built, it is rarely taken down. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has answers, and I'll show you where to find them.